All right, welcome everyone. Before we get started with our presentations, we do want to, I would like you to help me thank Dakota Supply Group for sponsoring the recording of today's sessions. The recording will be available via the North Dakota Water YouTube page after the conclusion of the meetings this week. So if you could help me give them a round of applause. All right, with that, I guess we'll get going with our first presentation, which is myself and Dani Hanson covering the $1 billion from the state of North Dakota. How do we put it to work? Which is just an overview of what took place at the 2021 legislative session this year.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Is that better? No? How about that? Okay, I'm getting some thumbs up.
We could make you move up to the front.
Right, yes. Feels a little bit like church. So Jack and I are going to go over a little bit of what we worked on your behalf during legislative session. And I'm going to start out by talking about the funding or the money side of legislative session. So when we talk about those buckets, we're really looking at three different areas. First is allocation of the Resources Trust Fund, which goes to the State Water Commission and then is allocated out to different projects around the state. We're going to talk a little bit about bonding, which I'm sure a lot of you heard about during legislative session. It was a big move forward for the state in bonding some really big water projects. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some new infrastructure loan programs that are going to be available this fall. So to start with the State Water Commission funding through the Resources Trust Fund, there was a lot of components that went into allocating those dollars, but the two line items that I think are probably of most interest to this group are the general flood line, which is a bucket of about $48 million that is put out there for flood control projects. And it's important to note this number is a lot less than what we've seen in the past, but in the past, big flood control projects like the ones being worked on in Minot with the Souris River Joint Board and the Fargo-Moorhead Diversion Project are no longer being funded through the Resources Trust Fund. So they took those two big projects out of the State Water Commission funding bill, and that number got smaller, but those dollars are going to go a lot farther now. So we're really excited to see that. There's also $14 million allocated for general water projects, which I know a lot of water resource boards allocate for. So those were kind of the two big buckets that we focused on, and we're working with appropriators and legislators on State Water Commission funding. There's also $1.1 million for a pilot project, and if you're interested, Ben Varson knows a lot about it. The Upper Cheyenne's been working on this project, but the idea is out there that should be looking at ways that we can work together to develop water management strategies on a basin-wide basis. And so there is a $1.1 million out there for really geared for a joint board to look at some across-county basin-wide projects. And there's a little bit of dollars for implementation and then some dollars for projects out there. So I know the Upper Cheyenne has been working on an application for that, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where that goes. That was another big part of House Bill 1020, which was the funding bill for the State Water Commission. Next bill I'll talk about is the bonding bill. Like I said, they took the Minot Flood Control Project, Fargo-Moorhead Diversion, out of the State Water Commission budget, and they put together a bonding package to pay for those projects. That's going to save a lot of money in building those projects. There's a lot of movement already happening on those projects thanks to the bonding program, and it also frees up a lot of resources trust fund dollars for smaller projects that wouldn't have been as competitive if they were trying to compete against those big flood control projects. So we're really excited to see the state move in that direction. There was a lot of discussion among legislators about whether that was the right move forward to go ahead and bond for those projects. But at the end of the day, everybody agreed that when it came to big flood control projects and water infrastructure, it was so important to the state that they were willing to go ahead and bond for those projects to make sure that they got done. So really would encourage you to run into one of your local legislators, thank them for their work on that, because it wasn't easy. It was complicated to put it all together, and it was a lot of conversations with colleagues, and we really appreciate all the work that they did during session on that particular project. Another piece that was included in the bonding bill is $50 million for an infrastructure loan program. Those loans will be available through the Bank of North Dakota. I think they have a 30-year term with 2% interest. So I know there are some groups that are looking at utilizing those funds. I think Garrison is one of them, to access some legacy fund dollars to as a loan that will be paid back to the legacy fund to implement some infrastructure projects. So overall, water was a big topic of conversation this year in Bismarck, especially on the funding side. And between the Resources Trust Fund allocation, bonding, loan programs, there was more than $1 billion allocated towards water this year, which really is incredible when you look at the overall state budget, and really goes to show how important water projects are across the state, and the kind of value that legislators see in putting state resources towards those. So again, would encourage you to thank your legislators for their work on that. It really was great to work with a lot of them. They're great champions for water when they are working at the Capitol. The final kind of funding piece I'll talk about that was actually in a policy bill that Jack's going to touch on and Sean's really going to talk about has to do with State Water Commission cost share. Some of you will probably remember that last fall there was an Attorney General's opinion that really tied the Water Commission's hands when it came to funding snagging and clearing projects. There was some confusion about the term maintenance that really prevented them from cost sharing on those kinds of projects. We worked with Representative Schreiber-Beck on a bill she was moving that had to do with water drainage, and we got some language added to that bill to clarify for the Water Commission that they could cost share on those projects. So that was an important piece of a policy bill that really has some big implications for projects from all kinds of water resource districts. Anybody that's doing those snagging and clearing projects, those are now eligible again for cost share. They had been historically for a long time. There's just a little bit of confusion with that AG's opinion. So really thankful to Representative Schreiber-Beck and the other groups that were working on that bill, that they were willing to let us use that as a vehicle to get some clarifying language for the Water Commission on that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jack to talk a little bit more about policy.
All right. So you've probably all received our legislative reports, and I will touch on a few of the bills that I guess are applicable to water resource districts. So first of all, the Water Resource District Manager Compensation Bill was House Bill 1216. The prime sponsor of this bill was Representative Damshin out of Cavalier County. Also signing on that bill were Representative Dick Anderson, Representative Munson, Representative Schauer, Representative Westland, Senator Dwyer, and Senator Elke. What this bill does is it amends 61-16-08, which deals with Water Resource District Manager compensation. It increases the max per diem from $135 up to what a member of the Legislative Assembly makes, which is currently set at $189. The minimum per diem is still $75. Each water resource district still has the discretion to set their own compensation. So this isn't a mandate. This just increases the maximum amount of compensation that a manager could make. Our association tested in favor of this bill, although there was some pretty strong support, and so it passed handily both in the House and the Senate. I'll talk about House Bill 1353, which is the Office of the State Engineer and the State Water Commission Reorganization Bill. The prime sponsor of this bill was Representative Schmidt, although he was joined by some pretty powerful legislators. He was joined by Representative Delzer, Representative Munson, Representative Jay Nelson, House Majority Leader Representative Pollard, Senator Kruen, Senator Shively, Senator Sorvog, Senator Bell, and Senate Majority Leader Rich Wardner also sponsored that bill. What this bill does is reorganizes the Office of the State Engineer and the State Water Commission into the Department of Water Resources. It grants powers and duties that were traditionally held by the state engineer to a director of that new Department of Water Resources. The director is appointed by the governor and is a member of the governor's cabinet. The justification for this bill, as described by its sponsors, was that the state budget for water resources in general has grown significantly, and that the director would be more of a business and PR manager as opposed to a technical expert. In addition, the state engineer was thought to be in charge of too many things. So there was a lot of discussion that the state engineer was stretched too thin, and that the financial aspects weren't being managed properly. So our Water Resource District Legislative Committee met and discussed this bill early in the session. It was a 129-page bill. The Legislative Committee adopted a resolution opposing this bill, but the North Dakota Water Users Legislative Committee met and discussed concerns, but also recognized that the legislators involved with this bill have been longtime supporters of water projects and wanted to be careful in any sort of opposition that we levied. And so we, the North Dakota Water Users, Dani, Lance, and I worked with Representative Schmidt and Legislative Council to draft an amendment that would mandate, I should back up, the opposition that we discussed was due to public infrastructure being managed by a non-technical expert, due to public safety concerns. Also just the longstanding success of the state engineer's office in developing and managing large water projects. So the North Dakota Water Users rep with Representative Schmidt and Legislative Council to come up with an amendment that required the state engineer be a professional engineer, and that who would be hired by the director, and that the state engineer would still be responsible for the department's oversight of dam safety, water appropriations, construction and drainage permits, and technical duties related to public safety and property protection. So this bill has passed, and the governor's office is currently looking to fill the new director position. I believe that the application period has recently ended. Moving on to the eminent domain bill, There was an eminent domain penalties bill which applied to airport authorities, municipalities, water resource districts, and Garrison Diversion and Conservancy District for irrigation assessment projects. So it wasn't, I guess we were one of the 4 political subdivisions that were named in this bill. And the sponsors were Representative Kading, Representative Schmidt, and Senator Sorlog. So what this bill proposed to do is apply penalties if certain conditions were met during condemnation proceedings. Relating to water resource districts, this bill proposed to provide penalties of 25% of the fair market value if a water resource district during a quick take deposited 10% or less of the ultimate determination that a jury makes at the conclusion of the condemnation proceeding. And so if the deposit in court or the appraisal that the water resource district initially obtains is really low, the water resource district would be hit with a pretty significant penalty. Also, if the taking was deemed unnecessary by a judge, the water resource district would get hit with a 50% of fair market value penalty to pay to the landowner. Our association elected not to testify on this bill due to strong opposition from other groups, and this bill failed in the House. Moving on to the culvert bill, the culvert sizing bill. The prime sponsor of this was Senator Wenck. Does anyone have any questions on the previous bills that I discussed? Okay. The prime sponsor of the culvert bill was Senator Wenck out of Stutzman County. This was also sponsored by Senator Conley, Representative Osley, Representative Pollard, and Representative Satram. Currently, North Dakota Century Code 24-03-08 allows a majority of landowners of an affected area, a county commission, or a township board, or a water resource district to petition the state engineer to do a design discharge study of a road crossing. And the state engineer will issue an opinion based on the stream crossing standards that are set by the state engineer. After that determination is made upon notice to the applicable road authority, the road authority, and I quote from the statute here, shall install a culvert or bridge of sufficient capacity to permit the water to flow freely and unimpeded through the culvert or bridge. So even though our statute, the language of that statute already requires the road authority to increase the size of their road opening to match the design discharge of the state engineer, in practice, that's just not done. The county is very reluctant to increase or construct a brand new bridge just to increase the flow. And so there was a situation in Stutzman County where a design determination was made, but the local road authority replaced a culvert with the original size, and it completely ignored the design discharge that was issued by the state engineer. In response, this bill was dropped in the pile, and it really it was really proposing to do what our statute already says, but it provided a stronger mandate, and ultimately the bill failed probably because we already have language. But that was it passed in the Senate narrowly, and this was a bill that was very drawn out. There was a lot of hearings on this one, and our association elected not to work on it due to the strong opposition from township and county associations, even though we discussed that having appropriate road crossings was a good thing, but ultimately we decided to stay out of this dispute. So moving on with, is there any questions about culvert sizing?
It's back to the way it was.
Correct. Yep. It stays the way that it was.
So can they, for example, county or township, if they can have a ruling from the state, can they ignore that ruling and do what they want?
Well, I don't know. I guess Sean and I might disagree on this one. The language of the statute says that the road authority shall install a culvert or bridge of sufficient capacity to permit the water to flow freely and unimpeded. And so I think that a landowner or a petitioning county commission, township, or water resource district would probably have some sort of, they could probably force that to happen. But I don't know if anyone's enforced that. But so I would say no, that they can't disregard it, even though it's routinely disregarded. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
During this, meeting, with the board policy and these sessions coming up, the call and sizing and the long impact to be ignored. So those upcoming meetings that we'll see what's going to happen.
That's a good question. I'm gonna defer to Dani on that.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but there was some discussion about studying this particular issue, culvert sizing, and what enforcement looks like. Ultimately, legislators decided that that was up to the state engineer's office and the state water commission to really look at, so they are not going to discuss it through interim studies. So I would not anticipate it being part of any of the conversations with water topics or with the drainage committee that we'll talk about here in a minute.
All right, any other questions? Or comments? Sean, do you have any, have you ever dealt with the situation, or Kale, have you ever dealt with the situation where a road authority has been forced to increase the size of their culvert or bridge under the statute?
Yeah, so in the statute, trade-off is that it says the road authority follows the stream crossing standard, then it's meet for liability. There's two places in the statute that talk about road crossing. One says when the roadway is redone, you shall do this. The other one says when the stream crossing study is done, the road authority shall do this. So I don't think there's any probably disagreement among attorneys over that unit doesn't follow it, but I think there's a question of what's the appropriate time to tell it, what if 40 years have passed, and at the time the culvert was put in, you know, it met whatever the standard was at that time. I think that's where it starts to get a little right. But, you know, clients that are facing this issue, kind of waiting to see what happens with that bill, or, you know, petition to ask the court for someone to culvert.
All right, well, thanks. Yeah, and I guess I've been in similar discussions, but I've never seen any enforcement action take place. So I don't know. All right. Moving on with the Water Resource District Assessment Authority topic. There was a House concurrent resolution, 3042. This was sponsored by Representative Ertelt and Senator Clemens. This resolution proposed to add a section to our North Dakota Constitution that would prevent any political subdivision from levying assessments or imposing fees, taxes, tolls, charges, or contributions unless the governing body was elected. Obviously, this would damage Water Resource District's ability to levy assessments for any assessment project, including assessment drains. Our association testified in opposition to this bill. The House Judiciary Committee recommended a due pass to the House, but it was defeated. I guess the last thing that I'll talk about is the Tile Bill 1437. Just to give you, I know Sean will be covering that in greater depth this afternoon, but just to give you a background of where that bill came from. Water managers and staff from Richland County, together with Sean Fredericks and a group of producers and tile installers, worked with Representative Schreiberbeck to come up with a bill that would streamline tile permit processing for both ag producers, tile installers, and water resource districts. During that effort, compromises were made by both sides, and there was a bill that was dropped in the pile early in the session that had strong support from ag groups and water resource districts. So, a big thanks to Sean and that group for all that work that went into that. In addition, over the interim, the North Dakota Water Users and Water Resource District Association, we were working to form an informal coalition with ag and commodity groups and infrastructure groups due to mounting opposition to Water Resource District Assessment Drain Authority. There was a number of conversations that we weren't invited to, that we tried to participate in, but couldn't get a seat at the table. I guess regarding some assessment drain projects that were controversial. Commissioner Mike Anderson had met with a number of different landowners who were upset with some assessments they'd received. And so we, reached out to, and this was in large part Lance Gaby, reached out to egg producers and other, like I said, township and county associations to let them know that there was a challenge coming to, rural flood control, basically. As a result of this cooperative effort, House Bill 1437 and House Bill, we'll get into it, House Bill 2208. House Bill 1437 had strong support from both producers and water resource districts. This bill passed unanimously in the House after a few cleanup amendments, but the Senate amended the bill to remove, they were really concerned with the notice requirement that was in that bill that Sean will cover for projects under 80 acres. Ultimately, the Senate passed the bill with an amendment that would only require the under 80 acre notice to projects that drained into an assessment drain or a tributary of an assessment drain was the language that was used. In conference committee, there was a long standoff, and we were concerned that this really good bill was jeopardized by a couple of small, what we felt were small issues. Representative Schreiber-Beck was working hard to honor the compromise that was reached over the interim with the Water Resource District group. But some of the Senate Ag Committee members were not convinced that the bill was perfect. So ultimately, a compromise was reached, and I believe the under 80 acre notice was one of the biggest sticking points, and I think that sunsets at the end of this biennium, correct? Yeah. At the end of 2022. And so, and I'll let Sean cover the nuts and bolts of that, of the final bill and how that will be implemented by water resource districts moving forward. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back to Dani unless there's any questions about this. Yeah, go ahead, Rich. Yep.
Will we be signing something today that says we were here?
Did we bring any certificates, Julie? Did we bring any certificates for? Yeah, we can pass those out. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to quickly cover a couple of things that we're going to work on over the next 18 months in the interim between now and the next legislative session. The first interim committee that we're looking at, Jack kind of mentioned Senate Bill 2208, and if we have time, I think I'll have him come back up and talk a little bit about the history behind that. But that bill ultimately formed a interim committee that is going to look predominantly at water drainage and assessment issues. It's a committee made up of legislators and non-legislators. Cliff Isendorf is going to serve on that committee on our behalf, and we'll be working with him and with the rest of the committee as they look at assessment practices, appeals process for assessments, and what the current code and structure is for putting those assessment projects together. As Jack mentioned, there's a lot of concern from some legislators about the way this process works and the way that water resource districts put those, especially the cost-benefit analysis together and how they make assessments on individual producers. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about that, and there could be some legislation coming in the next legislative session based on the conversations that happen over the next 18 months. So we're going to be actively involved in that interim study. The first meeting of that is next week, and Cliff's on the agenda 2 times for that meeting. So the committee will get to hear directly from Water Resource District members about what that process looks like. That committee is going to be chaired by Senator Wenck, who's from down in the southeast corner of the state and has been involved in some of the discussions around assessment drains. The second interim committee we are working closely with is the Interim Water Topics Committee. This is a standing committee. They meet every interim. Representative Schmidt, who we've talked a lot about this morning, is chairing that committee, and their first meeting was yesterday. So I was there in Bismarck. They met for about 6 hours, heard 16 presentations that covered just about everything in the water world. I know a lot of people that are here today were also at that meeting yesterday presenting. And that kind of laid the groundwork for what Representative Schmidt wants to study over the next 18 months or so. Some notable things I would point out that committee is going to work on. they're going to look at irrigation permits and how those are allocated through the State Water Commission and the Office of State Engineer. And they're also looking at some ownership studies for some of the state-owned water supply projects, including NAS up in the north part of the state, and the Red River Valley Water Supply Project, which is currently being constructed between Washburn and Fargo. So there'll be a lot of different things, a lot of different moving parts that committee is going to look at. And we're really glad to see that's a pretty large committee. I think there's 16 or 17 legislators on that. And a lot of folks that aren't necessarily on ag or natural resource committees during the legislative session. So they're what we consider maybe new to the water world. So it's a really great opportunity for us to get to know them and for them to get to know us and the issues that we're working on. So looking forward to working with that committee. And then finally, I will briefly talk about redistricting. This is kind of a political issue outside of just a water specific issue. But the Census Bureau collected numbers in 2020. Those numbers are going to be available later this fall. And based on those numbers, the legislature needs to redraw lines for legislative districts. So the legislative districts that you all live in could change depending on what those population numbers look like. And there is a committee, a redistricting committee, that is going to meet starting in August to look at that data and start putting together a plan to present to the legislature in November on what the new legislative map should look like. So there's been a lot of concern. This is one area that we have an opportunity to engage with some other groups, including a lot of agriculture groups. There's been a lot of discussion about what will those new numbers and a new legislative map mean for rural communities. As we know, there's large population growths in metro areas like Fargo, even Bismarck, Grand Forks, Minot. And so if there's more people coming to those larger urban areas, there's a chance that we will have fewer rural legislators representing some of the interests that are really near and dear to our hearts in Bismarck. So we're going to continue to work with them to find ways to advocate on behalf of keeping a rural voice in Bismarck and making sure that our interests are well represented. Interesting tidbit, the number of legislative districts is capped in the state constitution, and we have not reached that cap yet. So there is a possibility that in addition to just redrawing the existing lines, they could add new legislative districts, and perhaps those could be in more rural areas, so we could maintain the number of rural legislators out in the countryside. So with that, just know that we are continuing to work on your behalf in Bismarck and across the state through these interim committees, and we will be working with legislators as they come back in November to look at redistricting. And I would pause there and look to Julie to see how much time we have, but we could definitely take a few questions.
0.
Just tell me 0 time, okay? Yeah, if there is any questions out there, we can take those. If not, Jack and I will be around all day. Go ahead. So the legislative management has thrown out the week of November 8th as that date to come back and meet to do redistricting. But that was really dependent on when they get the numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau. There's been a lot of delays. They were supposed to get those numbers, I think, already. They haven't seen them yet. So it's really dependent on when they get those. Yep. Yeah, Ben. There is one legislator in the room that I see. Yeah, Mark Weber is here. Thank you so much for coming. And I know we had invites out. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the Rural Water Conference is also happening right now in Medora. That drew a lot of folks away. We were hoping to have some Water Commission representation here and maybe have a presentation from a commissioner, but they had already been obligated out in Medora. So we'll keep working on that. Okay, awesome. Well, if you have any other questions, find Jack and I throughout the day. We're happy to chat more about that. And I'll turn it back over to Jack.
All right. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Retka from Stantec Engineering. He'll be covering the topic of wetland banks. Will they work for water managers and agriculture? Matt is a North Dakota professional soil classifier and certified Minnesota wetland professional with Stantec based in Fargo. He has performed numerous wetland delineation and managed mitigation services through USDA NRCS in North Dakota. He is experienced with the ecological assessments and wetland regulations required to permit projects with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Minnesota Wetland Conservation Act, and USDA NRCS National Food Security Act. So this time, please help me welcome Matt.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'd ask if you could hear me, but I know there's some hecklers at the back, so I'm not going to ask. I'm just going to start talking. So if you can't hear me, say something. But thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me this morning. My name's Matt Retka. I work for Stantec. You might not be familiar with Stantec. It used to be Wenck. Wenck was the company I worked for 8 years, and they were just acquired by Stantec at the beginning of the year. I actually see that on the agenda. It still says Wenck, so I apologize, but Jack got it right. It's Stantec now. Good, I can figure out the slides. So I'm here to talk, as Jack mentioned, about wetland mitigation. I was just going to give an overview and overview of the options, some of the banking processes, some of the work that's going on in South Dakota right now, and what's up and coming in North Dakota. So there's a picture of me in a wetland. This is actually not far from here over in Nelson County. This is a North Dakota Department of Transportation wetland bank that we've been working on and monitoring for the last few years. I'm actually digging around looking for the riser pipe outlet structure of this site. This is taken last year when there was actually some water on the landscape. It's a little drier, as you can imagine, this year. But that's kind of a typical day for me looking at a wetland mitigation site in the summer. And I'd like to take the opportunity to take a little poll of the audience here. So how many folks here have worked on a wetland mitigation site through buying credits or anything of the like? So a handful. More hands are going up here. Don't be shy. I don't fight. Anybody worked on designing a mitigation site to enroll in a bank or on your own operation? See Josh, another one in the back. Just generally speaking, how many people here think they have a good sense just from a general perspective of what mitigation banking is? Most? Thanks, okay. So I think I can go through this pretty quick then, knowing most of you understand the mitigation banking process fairly well. But mitigation essentially is the restoration, creation, or enhancement of wetlands for replacing impacts to wetlands on another location. There's different types of wetland mitigation depending on the regulatory agency. There's the Army Corps Wetland Banks and North Dakota DOT Wetland Banks. There can be agricultural wetland banks. Minnesota has a system for agricultural wetland banking. South Dakota does it, and in North Dakota there's been a couple as well. There's also on-site mitigation replacement. My topic's gonna go a little bit into both of those, and feel free to ask questions if I confuse anybody, but I'll jump back and forth a little bit between on-site mitigation and banking. They are different. They're two different mechanisms that someone could use to replace wetland impacts for a project. So why the heck would anybody want to mitigate wetlands? Well, because their wetlands are regulated. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, the Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction over certain waters, basically tributaries or connections of wetlands to navigable waters. And oftentimes, Corps rules jump back and forth quite a bit, as some of you may be aware, but they can go quite a ways upstream from a river if there's connections where somebody may need to impact wetlands to a project for the Corps. As many of you know, I assume a lot of you are growers, farmers, Swamp Buster has its own set of wetland regulations through the Food Security Act in 1985 that basically prohibits conversion of a wetland for farm program participants. In 2014, that was coupled with the federal crop insurance. So in a nutshell, landowners and farmers enrolled in USDA programs have a responsibility to maintain wetlands on their property to remain eligible for the USDA programs and crop insurance. Hopefully, not too many of you have had to know those rules too well, having to go through a violation or something, but if you have, you may be brought you to learning more about mitigation. So again, the two mechanisms for wetland mitigation are on-site replacement and wetland mitigation banking. So on-site replacement being the creation or restoration is conducted with a specific project. For example, if you have a drainage project, let's say on a quarter section, and you know there's 5 acres of wetlands in that quarter section that you plan to drain, you can work with the regulatory agency, usually the NRCS, to create a mitigation site on your own property for those 5 acres. The other option would be going to a wetland mitigation bank, where in a banking situation, that entity has already created the 5 acres of wetland that you would like to replace for your project, and you can generally purchase through an exchange process with that bank to do your project in exchange for the wetlands that the bank has already restored or created. So to go in, drill down a little bit more on-site mitigation replacement. Again, this is where you may have land or your family may have land where you're going to look to impact wetlands on, and you're going to replace a wetlands on that same land. It can be cost effective compared to a bank site. And it also can be a good option for you to utilize some of the land that you may be not having in production, idle or marginal land, and that's cost savings compared to a bank. The cons to on-site mitigation are generally timing. So there's a bit of a process to go through the planning and permitting process with the regulatory agency, whether it be NRCS or Army Corps of Engineers. That if you have a drainage project you want to get going on this year, you may not be able to get the approval in time, which may kind of force you to go look for a wetland mitigation bank. The other things to consider with on-site banking are site constraints and feasibility. So not any piece of ground really works well, at least from a efficiency standpoint or cost point standpoint, to make a wetland on. There's certain conditions that make some sites more favorable than others. And you as a landowner have to take on responsibilities for that mitigation site. There's a risk of success, making sure that if you're going to impact and drain 5 wetlands, that you can create and maintain 5 acres of wetlands on your property. And there's long-term maintenance and management that goes in with those mitigation sites, as well as some probably professional assistance, either from an engineer, technical consultant, or maybe an attorney. One example I like to just use to highlight the cost of an on-site mitigation site is what it costs to move just an acre of dirt. An acre foot is 1,600 cubic yards. Generally, if somebody is looking to put a mitigation site on property that isn't currently a wetland, you generally having to move about 1.5 foot of dirt or 18 inches, which is 2,400 cubic yards. Most contractors charge about $3 a cubic yard to move dirt, and that ends up being a little over $7,400 just to move an acre foot of dirt. That doesn't include some of the other costs with design, attorney fees, materials, seeds. So the price can be limiting for on-site mitigation in some cases. No mitigation banking. Again, the pros for that can just be time and ease. The wetland mitigation banks are already developed, and if you have a project that you want to get going on, you often can just go to a wetland mitigation bank and purchase credits with a couple pieces of paper and be out the door. There's also a deferred reliability. Again, when compared to the on-site mitigation, when you go to a bank, you're not liable for maintaining those wetlands or keeping any of the maintenance or anything on a bank site. From a developer standpoint, bank sites provide a profit incentive, alternative income source for a site landowner who wants to enroll a site into a wetland bank. Some of the downsides of wetland banking can be cost, like I mentioned before, and availability of credits. There's not always a bank in your area that has credits or the number of acres of credits that you need. So the price of wetland banks is typically very dependent on the market supply and demand. Ag bank range, they varied quite drastically. Sorry, I'll hop the slide here. The price of wetland credits for ag banks has varied pretty drastically based on location and availability. I think we've seen prices at $8,000 or less per acre in North Dakota a couple years ago, and more recently down in South Dakota and across the Red River into Minnesota, some of those credits are going for over $20,000 an acre. So they can vary quite a bit. So on-site mitigation, a great option for some, but not for others. It really comes down to if you have land suitable for a mitigation site. It can come down to just your time, equipment, man, horsepower, and your time of your project, and when you need to get all that in line with the agencies. So wetland replacement typically needs to occur prior to the impact. So if you've got a drainage project coming up this year, you generally need to start planning that a year ahead of time to get the approvals from the agency. If you can meet all the thresholds, sometimes on-site mitigation is a good option. Again, the other option is going to a wetland mitigation bank, which is really a turnkey solution. If you have a proposed drainage project and there's a bank available and you can eat the cost, there's really nothing more to do other than sign some paperwork if there's an established bank in your region. Now, this slide is meant to break down just the process of establishing a wetland bank in a nutshell. So a wetland bank has to have a sponsor that is responsible for the bank. That sponsor secures funds to get the banking process up and running. The sponsor develops an agreement between the regulatory agency and their board or that sponsor's entity to say how they're going to manage their bank site. Generally, for ag bank sites, that's the NRCS that's approving that agreement or umbrella agreement, as we call it. Generally, there's a website or some mode of marketing and credit transportation, a way for sellers and buyers to contact that sponsor and look to get land enrolled in a bank. And one of the most important parts of the whole process is identifying land suitable for a mitigation bank site and performing some of the surveys, technical work on those sites to enroll land into a bank. If that all goes well, finalized bank site plans are finalized, easements are recorded on those bank sites, construction happens, and a bank sponsor can then sell and manage and market additional credit sales. So a wetland bank sponsor can really be any legal entity that can be responsible for finances and typically the holder of a property easement on those mitigation sites. They're typically responsible for the long-term management of the sites, as well as coordinating with the agencies, landowners, and technical providers to keep a bank site moving forward. The umbrella agreement, again, this is an agreement if an entity wants to start a wetland bank, they generally work to get one master plan approved with the regulatory agency, oftentimes the NRCS, to manage multiple sites under the same plan. So that when various landowners want to talk to this bank about enrolling their land into the bank for sale, they're all getting looked at and handled the same way. And then that gives some consistency with how the regulatory agency deals with that wetland bank site, manages the credit transactions and whatnot. So site selection and search. This slide and this topic is really as applicable to a bank site as an on-site wetland mitigation site. Preferred sites for wetland banking are areas that have drained or restorable wetlands. And I can appreciate, and I think you all can understand, a lot of times those areas that had ditches cut in them, certainly areas that were subsurfacely drained. People aren't oftentimes looking to take those areas out of production and roll them in mitigation sites. So those areas can be hard to find, but those are the most cost-effective, easiest ways to design with some assurance that you're going to have a successful wetland mitigation bite. One of the best options we see is expiring CRP, especially CRP land that at one time had restored wetlands to get enrolled into a wetland type CRP. Oftentimes, once that CRP comes out, if there's wetlands that were restored as part of that original CRP contract, they can be just directly rolled into a wetland mitigation site and getting credit for those wetlands that were restored prior as part of the CRP contract with really little to no additional engineering of the site. Other good options are just marginal crop ground with old, poorly functioning drains, areas that, maybe grandpa tried to ditch back a while ago and that ditch just hasn't been maintained, or due to downstream issues, those areas just don't drain like they used to. Those are often good areas to look at wetland mitigation. And the third and somewhat less desirable option is just any areas where you can capture water with some type of embankment or excavation. Again, these type of situations fall into what we call a wetland creation. So an area that was not ever historically wetland, but through engineering, excavation, embankments can be made wetland. They have a little bit more risk of success and oftentimes cost more. Again, moving dirt being the chief cost of trying to create wetlands in non-historic wetland areas. So the site evaluation, once you've identified some potential suitable sites, there's typically a pretty detailed site survey and assessment done to understand existing wetlands, proposed wetlands. 1 or 2 meetings with that landowner are usually a good idea to understand the process and get a good look at the sites. Part of that is just estimating the restoration costs, having that discussion right up front with the landowners about what's this likely going to cost, what's it going to entail. If that landowner is looking to enroll that property in a wetland bank site, there's usually an assessment of what the credit market is at the time. And the few biggest things that come up on these type of site assessments as red flags are generally if basins extend across property boundaries. We see this a lot where there's an option to plug a ditch or make an embankment or do something to an area that was drained or not functioning the way it should be. But oftentimes, based on elevations, there's not much you can do. Sometimes there's not as much as you'd like to be able to do to plug those drainage or restore that wetland without impacting neighbor property lines. So that's usually the number one red flag or deal breaker to look at with selecting a suitable mitigation site. Another one is just areas with excessively large drainages. Perennial streams, areas with really large watersheds and high flows can be problematic to creating embankments and designing structures to manage water, as I'm sure a lot of you can appreciate. Those can be costly and more timely than areas with somewhat smaller watersheds are a little bit more manageable water flows. Certainly, anytime there's an impact to a road or structure, that's something that's looked at during the site assessment, and sometimes there's just other unsuitable conditions such as soils or hydrology that make wetland mitigation sites harder to work with. Once you've identified a suitable site, it gets through that first stage of site assessments. If there wasn't grave issues with property boundaries or flows, we'd get into the design and construction of a mitigation site where the restoration processes are outlined, ditch plugs, creations through excavation, they're outlined on some engineering plans that get included into the mitigation plan. That plan also needs to outline the goals and maintenance plans of the mitigation sites. Acres of different types of grass seedings is often included in there, as well as some of the outlet elevation controls and whatnot that would go into a typical engineering plan set. So I mentioned easements, a couple of times leading up to this. I know that's a hot button with a lot of folks and landowners in the state, and wetland mitigation sites do require some type of easement. In the case of on-site wetland mitigation, and the easement language is generally tied to basically the replacement or that original project. Again, if you had 5 acres of wetland on a quarter section that you tile drained and you wanted to put into your own on-site wetland mitigation site, that easement language would generally be tied only to the 5 acres of wetland that you had replaced with your on-site wetland mitigation site. In the case of wetland mitigation banking, I think each bank through the agreement process, the master umbrella planning has some different language. In North Dakota, I think 99 years gets applied sometimes. But it's important maybe to mention that there usually is a termination clause of these easements. If, for example, you had a mitigation site and 20, 30 years change your mind, there could be options to work with replacing those acres somewhere else, either going to a wetland bank site after the fact and saying, hey, I had these 5 acres on this site, I'd like to move those to your bank site. Or if you had, in the case of on-site mitigation, you could theoretically even move that mitigation site somewhere else. That would be pending some approvals, and as you all know, political winds can change, but as of now, there's certainly options to terminate some of these easements for replacements, or if your drainage project didn't work out and you decided just to restore those original 5 acres of wetland that you had planned on draining, you could probably do away with your wetland mitigation site through the easement process. Mentioned site management. That's part of the mitigation planning, whether it's on-site mitigation or wetland mitigation bank. These sites need to be managed in their entirety to not only vegetation maintenance, but also fixing any of the ditches or embankments that go into the construction. Generally, there's a monitoring period for mitigation sites for the first few years to make sure that they get off to the right start, and generally trying to fix any issues with mitigation sites in the first couple of years is good practice to avoid having more serious issues down the line. Some of the major challenges with wetland mitigation is, again, finding suitable sites. Oftentimes it comes down to an assessment of what is existing wetland and what can be wetland. This comes down to the NRCS process with wetland labels, and prior converteds being the most favorable for wetland mitigation sites, as opposed to areas that are deemed wetland or farm wetland and on NRCS certified determinations. There's generally lower credit potential for areas that have existing wetlands or farmed wetlands as opposed to those prior converted croplands. And again, with the site suitability, finding those areas that don't negatively affect adjacent properties is probably the biggest issue we often run into. There can be some other regulatory constraints with mitigation sites. I mentioned a little bit about the Army Corps of Engineers. I know a lot of you are aware of State Water Commission policies. So areas that impound more than 12.5 acre feet require an appropriations permit, and areas that impound more than 50 acre feet require a construction permit through the State Water Commission. Those can be very timely permits to get. As maybe some of you have seen, we've been working with at least one individual for going on 2 years now, and just hoping to get that permit soon. So the timeliness of those permits from the State Water Commission can be an issue with larger sites. And as mentioned before, fluctuating credit markets and some of the issues with our burnabout easements make mitigation a challenge sometimes. So to flip over to the on-site wetland mitigation options, again, this is theoretically you have a project that you're going to impact 5 acres on your quarter section, and you're looking to mitigate on your own land. You can provide your own plan and do a mitigation yourself. You oftentimes may want help from an attorney or a technical consultant, but you can work with that regulatory agency, generally the NRCS for the USDA Food Security Act swamp busters, and you can put a mitigation plan together and with their approval, construct a site and do your drainage project. Now, you as a producer have to pay those construction costs and are liable for the success of that site, but it is an option to landowners and producers. In North Dakota, the North Dakota NRCS has a request for mitigation option where you can go into to a local office, any local NRCS USDA office, and fill out a form saying you're interested in mitigating wetlands for a drainage project, and they will provide that plan to you at no cost. Generally, those are prioritized in the date received, so the timeliness again of that can be a concern, and you again would be liable for the construction costs and the success of that site, but it is an option to work with NRCS on providing a plan for mitigation. Okay, I'll jump to a little bit of the work that's going on in South Dakota right now. So in South Dakota, the South Dakota Farm Bureau is a bank sponsor of the South Dakota Ag Wetland Exchange. This is a wetland bank site that was established a few years ago now for South Dakota farmers to be able to permit and mitigate for wetland impacts from a lot of the drainage going on in South Dakota. This project, this bank, I should say, was partly funded by a USDA grant, and it now works as a pretty successful platform for mitigating wetland exchange throughout the whole state. To date, approximately 250 acres have been approved or are currently pending approval for exchange since established in 2017. Here's a slide showing an example of one of the bank sites that was enrolled into the South Dakota Farm Bureau's wetland bank. This is a 12-acre site in Yankton County, South Dakota, so a little southwest of Sioux Falls, where this landowner restored 12 acres of prior drained wetland on what was mostly an older pasture through a ditch block and construction of a rock overflow. This project ended up costing the landowner about $30,000 to construct and reseed. In the South Dakota Farm Bureau's bank model, the credit purchase price is negotiated between the landowner who develops the site and the buyer. So it's almost an open market on a site-by-site, transaction-by-transaction process. In the South Dakota Farm Bureau's model, that landowner gets to retain 75 to 80% of the credit sale, that whatever price that it's negotiated to, the landowner retains the majority of that. The South Dakota Farm Bureau takes on 20 to 25% of that sale for the long-term management of the bank and the operational life fund of that site. So to drill down a little bit on the landowner requirements in the South Dakota Farm Bureau's model, the landowner continues to own that site after it's enrolled in a bank. The landowner provides some of the financial assurances during construction of the site. They have to sign the easement that the South Dakota Farm Bureau owns on the site, but the landowner has to agree to that easement. And the landowner pays for the construction and vegetation establishment and maintenance of the site over its life. Again, in this case, the landowner receives the majority, 75 to 80% of the credit sale revenue from the transaction. Jumping north to North Dakota, here is a map of the different watersheds. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. These are the big 5 broken down in the state, where mitigation bank sites really need to be looked at from the perspective of if you have an impact within a watershed, you need to mitigate within that same watershed. This is outlined in some of the statewide guidance on wetland mitigation banking in the state, as well as the NRCS specific language in the Food Security Act manuals. So some of the constraints with wetland banking in North Dakota in the past have been location and availability of sites. If you have a wetland drainage project, or if you have a drainage project that's going to impact wetlands in, let's say, Stutsman County, typically you couldn't go over to Cass County or Grand Forks County to buy wetland mitigation credits. So one of the issues, longstanding issue with the state is just the location and availability of credits in North Dakota. There is a group currently working on changing this. Got 6 of the ag groups in the state: Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, grain growers, corn growers, soybean growers, and durum growers have recently formed a partnership on working to establish a wetland bank site and wetland bank in the state, with the intent to provide cost-effective options for producers that need wetland mitigation options for their projects. They're just getting up and running, but hopefully in the next year there's a little bit more options through what they have going on. Okay, just to wrap things up a little bit, there's really 2 options for wetland mitigation replacement. You have on-site wetland mitigation replacement and wetland banking, both of which have proven pretty successful from both an agricultural and ecosystem standpoint by fostering more productive fields and healthier wetlands. This is done by overall improvements on the landscape, by relocating wetlands as set-aside areas that were farmed at one time that generally aren't farmed as a wetland mitigation site. And this has fostered and increased easier compliance with Swamp Buster. Ag-specific wetland banking provides a benefit for landowners, producers, and site owners by providing an alternative source of income for those individuals interested in wetland banking, as well as a very timely mitigation option for producers that need credits for projects that impact wetlands. And that is all I had, folks. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Serves as a joint board, we working in mining. And some of the wetlands that were incurred with this project. Dave Ashley is here, maybe you can verify this. It seems to me we paid $30,000 for those wetlands.
If you're looking for me to comment, sir, all I can say is that I know down in the cities, for example, so Minnesota, the Board of Soil Water Resources maintains bank sites in the cities. And again, the price of wetland mitigation is very driven by supply and demand of the market. Credits per acre down in Hennepin County, Dakota County go for well over $100,000 an acre commonly down there. So there's not many mitigation sites, and they get a pretty penny for them just because of real estate value. I'd imagine your project in the Sears Valley was a core impacted wetland site. So again, those are generally more expensive than ag specific wetland banks because the Army Corps has a little more rigorous process of wetland banking and criteria to maintain. So one would think it would be the same across the board, but there's just a lot more paperwork and gone through with more detail on the core side. So those credits generally cost more than an agricultural only wetland bank site.
Another question for you. Wasn't there a wetlands bank established in North Dakota many years ago?
I know there's a couple that have been pretty recent. As far as long-term history, I do not know. I know you guys may know Roger Ellingson, the Ellingson Banks. They've had some sites in this area and another group up in Devil's Lake, but I wouldn't know the history beyond that.
I wonder if Ducks Unlimited doesn't have a water mitigation bank. A couple of years ago, when Sargent County was doing a road project in the township road, federal funding for bridge replacement. Sargent County had committed a 8/10 of an acre wetlands for that road project. Ducks Unlimited offered to sell 8/10 of an acre for $30,000.
Ducks Unlimited does have an in lieu fee program, which was probably the one offset I didn't talk about here. It is more along the lines of banking at a fee set between an entity and an agreement with the regulators. Again, I assume that's an Army Corps type project where the cost of credits is generally higher.
The county had to take those three bridges and get funding to replace another place, raise the road bed because it was kind of
You know, if when you're doing a mitigation site, you have to have the mitigation site completed before you start your drainage process.
The short answer is yes. Now, I don't want to speak on behalf of the NRCS, but they generally sign some paperwork that gives you about a year grace period. When you generally have to put a plan together, go to them, the USDA, and say, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to impact, here's my mitigation site. And at that time, they would file some paperwork, a warranty easement deed, mitigation agreement that sometimes grants you about a year variance. Now, the laws within Swamp Buster don't necessarily tie to that, so you do that at a little bit of a risk, but I haven't heard of that being an issue. With as long as you construct it within a year, that that you agree to. That's been my understanding.
So if you have a drainage project and you have some wetlands, you need to go through those. You really don't have too much of a choice as to what you can or cannot do. If you're gonna do the project, you're gonna get involved in mitigation. So start early. And there's another part about this where there are easements on land, perpetual easements. And when you get into those things, there's some information that we picked up on that you can clean through some of those perpetual easement areas and not violate the laws. But you have to make sure that you're working with, say, John Tackla out of the Fish and Wildlife Service. But those easements are not designed to stop water problems. They are designed to maintain wildlife interest. So you can work with, say, John, and go through some of those areas to clean through perpetual easements. Just make sure you understand.
Yeah, thank you for that. I assume you're talking about the Fish and Wildlife Service easements on property, yeah.
Another part about that $32,000 an acre, they agree to maintain that wetland. Or some of your cheaper stuff, you talk about the maintenance of it. Where does that maintenance fall? Falls back on the land.
Yeah, correct. All right, no other questions? Thank you all for your time.